Welcome to Introduction to the Middle East. And I think a good place to start is by defining our terms. What do we mean by the Middle East? What part of the world are we talking about? So you can see on the map here, largely focusing on Asia, though you can also see Europe. Let us first note that the term Middle East was invented by Europe, which is not really that surprising if you think about the actual terms. It's a relative term. East of what? East of Europe. Middle in the sense that it's not as far away as, say, China or Korea, often referred to as the Far East. It is interesting to note, however, that the term Middle East gained currency in the region fairly early on, if we're thinking about the modern period. So today, people coming from the Middle East very often refer to it exactly as that. Even the name of an important Arabic language paper, Al-Sharq al-Awsat, which is Arabic for the Middle East. So the next question we might ask then is exactly which countries. If we're thinking about a modern day map, what modern day nation states do we see as being part of the Middle East? And this is where there could be some room for disagreement. So here we have a modern map of the Middle East, and I think if we're talking about countries located on the Arabian Peninsula, nobody would really dispute that they're part of the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, the Gulf states. By the way, the name Saudi Arabia is a very modern name, referring to the ruling dynasty, the House of Ibn Saud. So if you went back in time, even to the beginning of the 20th century, you wouldn't see that name there. Countries like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, again, no one really disputing that they're part of the Middle East. By the way, I'm going to be using the term Israel-Palestine, particularly if talking about the modern period, as kind of a way of acknowledging that it is a contested territory between two different peoples, not taking a position in that regard, at least not at this point. If we go back further in time, for instance, I won't be using the term Israel. Israel didn't exist until 1948, so it was up until that point known as Palestine. But we'll talk more about that later. As far as what comprises the Middle East, the countries we already listed, I think no one would dispute. We might consider now Egypt. And some of you might be thinking, well, isn't Egypt really a part of Africa? Well, it is, but it can be both. It can be part of the Middle East and part of Africa. And if we're talking about the history of the Middle East, its culture, intellectual developments, politics, economic connections, and so forth, you simply cannot not include Egypt as part of the Middle East. It just wouldn't work. Very important cultural and intellectual center in the Islamic world and so forth. In a similar vein, we should also include Turkey. Turkey, also part of Europe. By the way, you couldn't really do a history of Europe without including Turkey, but by the same token, you really can't do a history of the Middle East without including it. And then finally, we have Iran, definitely part of the Middle East. But again, if you were doing a history of regions to the east of that, Iran would be a very major part of that history. This shouldn't surprise us, right? Whenever you try to define a region, there's not like there's some kind of seal-tight border preventing any kind of interaction between countries in that region and further afield. Now, some of you might be thinking, why are we not including North Africa? And very often, if we're looking at a history of the Middle East, it would include countries as far away as Morocco on the Atlantic coast. And that's because there is a lot of influence, particularly running from the Middle East into North Africa, but in the other direction as well, linguistically, culturally, and so forth. But you can kind of tell a history of the modern Middle East, history of the Middle East altogether without really getting into what was going on in North Africa that much. So, we will occasionally reference it. If we had more time, I might very well have included it. So in part, the decision not to reflects, certain kind of practical constraints. We have 16 weeks. This is a survey course, so we're covering a broad chronological period. The same kind of also applies to places like Afghanistan, Central Asia, Though generally speaking, like if you get a book on the history of the Middle East, they're not really going to include Central Asia or Afghanistan. Afghanistan kind of an in-between country, somewhere between the Indian subcontinent, that particular history, and the Middle East. But just, so that there's no confusion in that regard, we won't really be discussing Afghanistan or Central Asia in this course. So we might at this point consider the kind of environment that defines the Middle East. And, most of you probably are aware of the fact that much of it is made up of desert, and there certainly is a lot of truth to that. Particularly if you're talking about the Arabian Peninsula, but also if you're talking about Egypt. Having said that, it's a quite diverse region. As you can see from this map, there are many parts of the Middle East that are much more lush. I'm not promoting the idea that we're talking about tropical jungles or anything like that, but kind of more temperate zones. Some of this reflects the fact that you have parts of the Middle East that are highly elevated on plateaus. So, relative to some parts of the world, a bit more arid, a bit more dry, but certainly habitable and places where fairly large populations can thrive. As far as where the deserts are, that usually reflects the fact that you have mountains that are preventing clouds from getting into those areas, so they don't get a lot of rainfall. So definitely many parts of the Middle East capable of sustaining large populations, but as you'll note from this map, very often concentrated in areas, limited areas that are considered arable. So, we have Algeria here, which is in North Africa. Most of the population living along the Mediterranean coast, right? So it's like, really about only 3% of the country is arable, i.e. where you can grow food. Egypt, very similar. The vast majority of people living on the Nile River. So you have this kind of ribbon of green running north-south through the country. Most of the rest of it desert. Iran indicating 0% arable. I'm not sure that is accurate. But then you can see some parts of the Middle East considerably better in that regard. You're talking about Iraq, where you have a fair amount of fertile land centered around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Israel/Palestine, Jordan. So up until the kind of more elevated parts of the country, the rainfall is pretty normal there. And then you have so along the Mediterranean coast, that would also include Lebanon. Here, Palestine, probably referring to the West Bank and Gaza, but we could kind of lump those two together. Saudi Arabia, very dry, not surprising. And then so forth, Turkey, Syria, probably at the top in terms of the amount of land they have that you can grow food on. And you can see populations are quite large, but I think population density gives you an idea about the fact that people are often concentrated in limited areas of land that are arable. So this is certainly the case, where the numbers are low. This would indicate that, if you're considering the country as a whole, the number of people per square mile is relatively small, right? So it's a low number kind of indicates that they're concentrated in one part of the country. Larger numbers indicates that they're pretty much able to be spread out in terms of where people live. Now, if we're talking about the demographics of the Middle East, we should also note, and this is, later on when we get to the modern period and perhaps we begin to consider some of the issues confronting the region, why there has been a fair amount of conflict. In the media, they often talk about religion, and, of course, politics is definitely a factor. I think religion is highly exaggerated, and we'll talk more about that later. But one major factor is that they have a lot of young people. So the statistics here are a bit out of date, so it's actually even the numbers are larger if we're talking about how many young people. You have what we call a youth bulge. Right, so over 30%, probably more now, the population between the ages of 15 and 29. At the time that this survey was done, about 100 million youth. And, why is that an issue? I mean, having a lot of young people can be a very positive thing, but it really depends on whether you have enough resources to go around in terms of jobs, schooling, housing, and so forth. And this is where you run into a bit of a problem in the modern Middle East. And so whenever you have a lot of young people who are feeling very frustrated because they're, not able to find a meaningful job, and then perhaps not able to get married because of that, and then not able to raise a family and so forth, or find a house, and you're just kind of scraping by, well, that can be a recipe for for problems, right? Where a lot of people are feeling highly agitated, and then, political issues might be able to harness that sense of frustration and so forth. So I would suggest is, if you're thinking about why you have conflict, not just in the Middle East, but in many parts of the world, this kind of thing can be a major factor, right? Just, the fact that people feel frustrated and aren't able to have a satisfactory life. And that, I think, applies especially to young people who have a lot of energy to go alongside of that. And the Middle East is still growing. So as of 2007, this chart here is a little out of date again, and I'll have to update it at some point. But you had 432 million people in the Middle East, here inclusive of North Africa. And again, considering how many of them are young, but already projecting for 2050, 692 million. So imagine if they're already having difficulties providing resources so that young people can have, meaningful livelihoods, families, and so forth, a decent place to live. That problem is probably only going to get worse. And, we haven't even considered problems related to climate change. And as we noted, people tending to be concentrated in a limited number of areas, right? So Cairo, one of the biggest cities in the world. And, we live here in New York, and we think of New York as a, incredibly large city. But quite frankly, we are dwarfed by Cairo. Not just in terms of size. Cairo, last time I checked, we're talking about 22 million people. So compared to New York, between 8 and 12 million, depending on whether you include suburbanites coming into the city to work. So, a large number of people concentrated into small areas. By the way, I've been to Cairo. It's a wonderful city. But, they say New York is the city that never sleeps. Well, we have nothing on Cairo in that regard. It's a very intense kind of place, which, can be a positive thing too. A lot of positive energy. But, if you're running the country, you really have to think about how you're going to provide resources, particularly for younger people, and also, taking care of older people and things of that nature. Now, of course, not all cities in the Middle East are as big as Cairo, so including here an example of a smaller yet very cosmopolitan city, the city of Beirut in Lebanon. It is worth noting at this point that the Middle East, a very urban environment, the vast majority of people living in cities or very, very large towns. So this is actually, kind of a more recent development. If you went back to the beginning of the 20th century, much larger population, the countryside. But over time, people increasingly moving to the cities, looking for opportunities, and again, too often not finding them. So I'd like to briefly come back to a consideration of the topography, the kind of environmental landscape of the Middle East in terms of where people can live. So what you see here, often referred to as the Fertile Crescent, though more often when talking about ancient history, but it gives you a pretty good idea of, the limited amount of arable land. So this would roughly correspond to the modern states of Iraq, Lebanon, parts of Syria, and then Jordan, Israel/Palestine. And then you can see over to the left the green ribbon of the Nile River, and everything else that you see here extremely dry. A little less so to the north, so the map is a bit misleading, but if you're talking about around the Nile River or the Arabian Peninsula, really desert kind of environment. As for why much of the interior is so arid, we briefly mentioned it, but I think this map helps to illustrate kind of how this works climatically. So here we have a map of, this would be the western part of the Fertile Crescent, historically often referred to as the Levant, as in where the sun rises, a kind of derived of French, corresponding to northern Israel, Palestine, and southern Lebanon. So you can see a range of mountains running north-south, the central mountains in Israel, Palestine, and then becoming the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains as you move north. And so basically what happens is the clouds are not really able to move past these mountains, and so not a lot of rainfall making it to the other side. So, very habitable along the coast, but then as you move to the interior, becoming extremely dry. And I think this map of Anatolia also helps to illustrate how that works. So you can see kind of rimming Anatolia. Anatolia, by the way, being the kind of geographical term for the landmass roughly corresponding to Turkey. There's a bit of Turkey that is in Europe, on the European continent geographically speaking, so not part of Anatolia. But in any event, you can see kind of rimming the coastline pretty much all around, ranges of mountains, and this is what prevents the interior from getting a lot of rainfall, so it ends up being very dry. Not quite as dry as in Arabia in this case, so definitely habitable, but fairly arid. But you can also see quite lush along the coastline, right? So, rain, adequate rainfall along the coastline, but then not a lot of it getting to the interior. And that brings us back to the first topographic map that we looked at. And again, you can kind of see, I think after looking at those other maps, get a clearer idea regarding the kind of landscape, the environmental landscape that we're talking about in the Middle East, which areas are particularly dry, but then some areas that, though arid, definitely habitable, maybe not really good for producing food, but they provide enough resources that you can actually have towns and even some cities there. Now, we might consider the Middle East also from the point of view of the peoples that inhabit it. We tend to associate the Middle East with Arabs, and there's definitely good reason for that. Large numbers of people living in the Middle East are Arab. In some places, predominantly so. For instance, Saudi Arabia, about 90% Arab, ethnically speaking. Iraq, 75 to 80%. But we have other peoples in the Middle East who we really should be clear, whether speaking ethnically, linguistically, in terms of how they identify themselves, how other people see them, are definitely not Arab. So, for instance, in the northern part of Iraq, you have a substantial Kurdish population, making up about 15 to 20% of the entire population of Iraq. And then you have smaller groups who, like Turkoman, Assyrian, who make up about 5%. Though here, by the way, sometimes, to what extent they really constitute distinct ethnicities, or it has more to do with their affiliation with a particular religion. For instance, Assyrians very often generally are Christian. They have their own very distinct church. Whether they are ethnically not Arab or not is something disputed, not necessarily agreed to even by some of those who affiliate with the Assyrian church. But then, we have other substantial populations where there really is no disagreement as far as, the idea that these people are, somehow definitely a distinct people. They're definitely not Arab. So, for instance, Turkey and Iran are, in that regard, we really should be very careful to be clear. Turkey, largely made up of Turkish people. Turkish people, so they have their own language. They are a distinct ethnicity. They're not Arab. Certainly, historically, they've interacted with Arabs, but have always really seen themselves as a distinct people. By the way, Turkey also has a large Kurdish population, which has, in modern times, been a bit of a political issue, which hopefully towards the end of the course we can discuss a bit. And then finally, Iran. And, I cannot stress this enough, and it's worth stressing because a lot of people really assume that Iranians are Arabs, and they definitely are not. They do not see themselves as Arab. Arabs don't see them as Arab. They have their own language, the Persian language, or often referred to as Farsi. And then, probably a lot of you knew that. What some of you probably didn't know was that you also have a substantial number of smaller ethnic groups like Azeri, Gilaki, and then Kurdish, Arab, and so forth. Like Azeri, very often seen by many as, kind of almost a subset of Persian identity, or definitely very closely related linguistically, ethnically, and so forth. But in any event, the main takeaway here, Iranians definitely not Arab, not speaking Arabic, except perhaps as a second language and so forth. And you don't want to confuse the two. We might also break down the region on the basis of religion. Now, of course, the vast majority of people in the Middle East are Muslim, but definitely not all. And then, of course, we might make a distinction between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, which we'll learn a lot more about later, though some of you are probably aware of that distinction. So, in some countries, really just pretty much the entire population are Muslim. In Saudi Arabia, 100% Muslim, apart from any guest workers, like if you have people coming from Europe or United States. And Sunni Islam, featuring very prominently in how the state is organized politically, socially, and so forth. A country like Egypt, again, vast majority are Sunni Muslim, but there you have a substantial Coptic Christian population, Coptics being a sect of Christianity that is indigenous to Egypt. By the way, some would argue that they make up closer to 20% of the population, but officially 6%. And, I don't want to get into that too much here, but let's just say probably the true number lies somewhere in between. And definitely there are large numbers of Christians in the Middle East. Famously, for instance, in Lebanon, and when we learn more about the modern state of Lebanon, we'll see that featured prominently into how the state came into existence. Though even there, only making up 30% of the population, 70% are Muslim and actually divided almost evenly between Sunni and Shiite. Iran, probably, what in some ways distinguishes it from the Arab world, apart from the fact that Iranians are not Arab, is the fact that it is a Shiite majority Muslim country. And it's probably really the only country where pretty much everyone who is Muslim is Shiite, though you do have a small minority who are Sunni, and then even smaller minorities of non-Muslim groups like Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians, Baha'i, and so forth. And then, of course, we have Israel. So in this context, I will simply say Israel because we're talking about the Israeli state and people who self-identify as Israeli. So vast majority are Jewish, 80%, though it might surprise some people to know that about, close to 20% of Israeli citizens are in fact Palestinian. When I say Israeli citizens, meaning that their passports say they're Israeli. In principle, they have all the rights that all Israelis enjoy, though in practice, there are some who would dispute that that's actually the case. But there is obviously a strong connection between being Jewish and the Israeli state in terms of how the state came about, in terms of traditions, customs, the political system, and so forth. You'll note I also have here a pie chart breaking down Israeli society on the basis of ethnicity because Israel, in some ways, in many ways, you could say is an immigrant state, very much like the United States. There was, at the beginning of the 20th century, an indigenous Jewish population, but it was less than 10%. So the vast majority of Jewish Israelis are, some of them are second, third generation, but can claim ancestry going to Europe or the United States or also other parts of the Middle East, some of them coming from North Africa, like Morocco, some coming from Yemen, Iraq, and so forth. But, you know, the fact of it being an immigrant state has also shaped the way in which it has developed. So, by way of wrapping up our introductory lecture, I think we should talk about Islam a bit, just because, we're beginning our history of the Middle East with the advent of Islam, and this is kind of the convention in history, the dividing line between the ancient history of the Near East and the history of the Middle East up until today. Right, very often using the term Near East to refer to kind of the pre-Islamic period, going all the way back to some of the most ancient civilizations that we know of. The reason for this is that Islam, in addition to being very quickly becoming one of the world's most major religions, is also going to lay the foundations for an entirely new kind of civilization. And so pretty much everything changes with the advent of Islam. Now, having said that, Islam is, you know, at its core is a religion, and we should learn a little bit about it, particularly given that there are so many misunderstandings about what Islam is, and you know what it is that Muslims believe. A lot of ideas about that Islam is somehow a abnormally violent religion compared to others, for which there is really zero evidence of any empirical kind, and not least if you're considering how much killing has taken place by who over the last century and a half. But in any event, right, I thought we should probably start with this introductory lecture with just some basic well-grounded factual information about Islam. Right. So first of all, the term Islam is what we call a verbal noun, basically for the verb aslama, meaning to submit. Well, a lot of people, almost immediately are going to say, what they mean is that non-Muslims are supposed to submit to Islam, and that's not what they're referring to at all. They're talking about the fact that Muslims, people who have made the decision to become Muslim, are willing to submit themselves to God, right? So the term literally referring to an act of submission to the will of God. And the idea, this is actually not something so unique to Islam. The idea that, by adopting a particular religion, you're kind of putting yourself in the hands of God. I mean, I think this is a very prevalent idea in Christianity. A lot of people, when they say they became Christian, they're kind of like, I was trying to control my life. That wasn't working out. So I kind of turned my life over to God and, let him kind of direct me, right? So in a sense, not that different from that idea. It kind of relates to the idea that, everything in the world has its Islam, kind of its purpose, its direction. Only human beings, though, can choose not to follow their Islam, right? Not to align themselves with the will of God for, what he has in store for them, what he plans for them, and so forth. That when we try to go against that, right, it's kind of like trying to swim against the current, right? And so generally things don't go that well. And so, if you just allow yourself to accept God's will, things will go better for you, right? It's, another analogy might be, for instance, if you're a sports player, right? And when, if you're playing basketball, when everything just goes in the net, you're in the zone, right? You're not thinking that much about it. You're just kind of feeling it intuitively, right? So that's kind of what they're referring to when you kind of let God into your life, from the Muslims' point of view. But again, I think this is also from many different, the perspective of many different religions. So Islam, verbal noun, to submit. The one who submits, this is basically the active participle. So it's literally kind of a grammatical structure, is a Muslim. Right? It is the active participle for the verb aslama. So what does it mean to actually be a Muslim, right? So, every religion you have kind of an idea that there are certain things you're supposed to believe and or do that define you as being part of that religion. In Islam, what makes you a Muslim is that you basically are adhering to the 5 pillars. as they call them, right? There are basically 5 pillars that define you as a Muslim, starting with Shahadah, or testimony. That is basically you making the decision to become a Muslim, right? When you say it and you mean it, that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. La ilahi illa Allah wa Muhammad rasuluhu, right? And of course, you have to mean it. But if you commit to that, then you have begun your journey as a Muslim. Now, as a Muslim, it is expected that you should engage in what is known as salat, or communal prayer, right? The worship of God, usually as a congregation, and there are 5 set times during the day that you should be doing this. Now, we should make a distinction here when we're talking about worshiping God. It's the idea that you're praying for the glorification of God, right? Hence why it's really kind of important. You can do this as an individual, and there are very specific prayers that you should say in connection with this, but it works best as part of a congregation, i.e. in a mosque. Thawm, or fasting, during the daytime, during the month of Ramadan, right? So Ramadan is a month on the Islamic calendar. And by the way, the Islamic calendar is a lunar one, shorter than a solar calendar, which is why the month of Ramadan moves over the course of a solar year. And the idea is that you should fast only during the daytime. In the evening is, kind of a celebration. Anyone who has experienced Ramadan in a Muslim community, particularly if you're in a Muslim majority country, the evenings are extremely festive. Now, having said that, fasting means not just not eating, it means not drinking, not smoking, abstaining from sex, and so forth. So I spent the month of Ramadan in Cairo one time. The evenings were great, but I have to admit people were a little edgy during the day. I suspect it had more to do with the not smoking than anything else. But so it's not easy. But a large number of Muslims, some Muslims don't do it, just like, you have many people who are Catholic or Protestant or whatnot, and they kind of consider themselves somewhat religious, but they might not actually engage in all the traditions and requirements of their faith. But large numbers of Muslims do, and they actually usually think of it in a very positive way as something very rewarding. Zakat, or tithing, right? So the providing for the needy, usually is a kind of designated share of your income or property, but it's kind of the idea that you should be helping to look out for the community as a whole, right? So Islam, many similarities to Christianity, I think that they both have aspects that have more to do with the needs of the individual, and also aspects dealing with the needs of the community. But I would suggest that maybe Islam emphasizes the latter a bit more than is often the case in Christianity, right? Like that you really have this sense of obligation to look out for those that around you that are in need. And then finally, Hajj, or pilgrimage, the idea that once in your lifetime you should make the pilgrimage to Mecca, the birthplace of Islam. We're going to learn more about that in the next lecture. But I want to stress, particularly with Thawm and Hajj, there really is this strong emphasis on, as you are able, right? So, I mean, if you're feeling ill, or you're, pregnant or elderly, or, something that might make fasting for the entire day actually dangerous to your health, there's kind of a real strong expectation that you shouldn't do it then. Right? There's no idea that you should in any way be harmed by this practice. And with Hajj, there's kind of a recognition that not everyone might be able to do it, right? Because of, maybe you just can't afford it, or you have some other kind of obstacle that makes it very difficult to travel. So this wouldn't be counted against you. Having said that, I can't say, this is kind of more anecdotal. I can't swear to you this is true for all Muslims, but the Muslims I've talked to that have done Hajj considered it to be a tremendous experience, to the point where actually I'm quite envious, and only out of respect for Islam that I would not go to Mecca, but otherwise I would jump at the chance. So looking at each of the pillars a little bit more closely, right? So Shahadah, testimony. La ilaha illa Allah wa Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. So, by the way, this is also about the centrality of the belief in the oneness of God, right? So this is what we call kind of a creed, right? Like in a sense, a belief that defines you as belonging to that particular religion, right? So very important for the Muslim is the idea of this very kind of powerful monotheistic idea of the oneness of God, or tawhid is what they call it, right? There is just the one God. But not just that there is only one God, but the oneness of that God, right? That he doesn't have what philosophically or theologically speaking we might call attributes, which is where many Muslims run into a problem with the idea of the Holy Trinity in Christianity, right? The idea of kind of three gods in one: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. By the way, Jews also very often find that very problematic. And Christians have actually had to develop some very sophisticated theology to explain how you can have that and still have a purely monotheistic God that is, where it's all about his oneness. By the way, the Shahadah, very similar to the kind of core Jewish testament, is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, right? The oneness of God. Well, that brings us to salat, or prayer. And I had mentioned that, there's this kind of idea. There are 5 specified times during the day that you're supposed to pray, ideally as part of a congregation. So in order to ensure that people know when that time has arrived, most mosques will have a muezzin, someone who goes to the top of the minaret and will issue the call to prayer. So if you've ever been in a city that is, where it's a kind of Muslim majority city with many mosques, it's really something that is very powerful, right? You'll hear the call to prayer issuing from many different points, so it kind of has this echoing effect. And I actually, for instance, when I was living in Cairo, I found it quite beautiful, right? So the idea is then that you pray as a congregation in the mosque. You should all be facing in the direction of Mecca, towards the Kaaba, which is the central shrine of Islam located in Mecca. And we'll learn more about that in a bit. I should make a distinction between salat, which is prayer done in congregation for the purpose of glorifying God, versus du'at. Du'at is like, kind of, sometimes in English we use the word petition, like that you want to petition the Lord with prayer. The idea that you're praying for something for yourself, right? That it could be something as simple as, dear Lord, I'd like a bicycle for Christmas or something like that. Or it could be, that someone close to me is ill and I pray for their recovery. It could also be a devotion, just a prayer of, that your kind of own personal devotion to God or to a saint and so forth. So in Islam, they make a very important distinction between these two different kinds of prayers. So, you have the same thing in Christianity and Judaism and so forth, even if we don't use different terms to describe different forms of prayer. So one last word on salat. When you go to the mosque to pray, there's kind of the idea that you should, be presentable to God. So somewhere near the entrance of every mosque, you will find an ablution fountain, a place where you can kind of wash your face, your hands, your feet. You should take your shoes off when you enter the mosque. So, the idea, of course, is that is kind of a sign of respect towards God. But I might add that particularly in an arid environment, where very often it can get quite dusty, you have to think this would have been just something really nice for yourself when you came in, right? To kind of, clean the dust off yourself. But this also helps to get you into the right mindset. And then we have Saum, the fasting during the month of Ramadan. As you can see, there's kind of the idea that you should devote some of that time when fasting during the day to prayer. And certainly many Muslims do, though... much like many Jewish people I know who during the fast of Yom Kippur might try to pass as much of the day in bed. So you have that kind of approach as well. But, again, this is not considered a kind of sad or tragic affair. And especially important is when the sun goes down, you feast. And that's kind of evident from the image in the upper left-hand corner. Might be why we often say Ramadan Karim, generous in the sense that people should be generous with one another. If you were in a city like Cairo during Ramadan, you would see a lot of banquets being set up for those who maybe are a bit in need. And, very kind of open door policy. People are welcome to take part in the feast being provided. So it's also a very communal kind of thing. And then we have Zakat. One translation might be alms, kind of an old-fashioned term in English, but the idea of providing charity for the poor. And initially this began as a tax levied on all adult members of the religious community, the Ummah. Now it often is has more of a voluntary aspect of it, though it depends on what country you live in. But again, this idea, we should note, is not unique to Islam. Many churches might even have a stipulation that people should donate a certain percentage of their income, tithing, that would be used then for charitable purposes. And then finally we have Hajj, which takes place on Dhul Hijjah. And it's basically the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, Mecca being probably the most important point of destination. This is the birthplace of Islam and also housing the most important shrine in Islam, the Kaaba, which you see here at the center of this great mosque. And you can see, I don't know how clear it is, but you can see that there is quite a large number of individuals. All those little pixels are actually people. And there are many different traditions associated with doing Hajj, with, for instance, visiting the Kaaba, that you should go around it a prescribed number of times. Then you have other traditions. For instance, one tradition is running back and forth between 2 points, Safa and Marwa. The idea of kind of replicating an episode from the early history of Islam, when Hagar was trying to find water for Ismail and was running between 2 different points until God finally provided water, what is the Zamzam Well. And so, of course, it's considered to be a kind of holy water, if you will, that you get water from this sacred well. And then we have other traditions as well, for instance, where you might pay a visit to the plain of Arafat, where Muhammad made his last speech to the Muslim community before he passed on. Along the way, you might pass this pillar considered to represent the devil or Satan, and one tradition is to throw stones at it as a way of kind of rebuking Satan. And we might conclude our discussion of the Hajj with just a few words about the stone, this black stone that is embedded in one wall of the Kaaba that is considered very sacred. It's actually, from a scientific point of view, considered to be likely a meteorite. But there are many traditions about it being a stone that fell from heaven. Many stories associated with it. For instance, that initially it was white, but then it became dark from the when people would visit the site, they would touch it, and so it kind of accumulated the sins of humankind. One very famous episode has to do with when the stone fell out, and it was considered such a privilege that someone might have the right to actually replace the stone into the wall that they kind of argued about who should have the right to do it. The various important tribes, or I should say clans, in Mecca. And so in the end, Muhammad, who at that point was not yet, I believe, not yet a prophet, but already had a reputation for being extremely honest and fair and very just, came up with a solution that they would all take part in replacing the stone by carrying it on a carpet that they would all hold, and then he would have the honor of actually setting the stone, picking it up off the carpet and putting it back into the wall. We might at this point consider one concept often mistaken for one of the 5 pillars of Islam, but which definitely is not. And it's definitely an important concept, but also one that is very gravely misunderstood, and that is jihad. Often understood as translating as holy war in English, but this is not true. It actually means to exert oneself, ideally in the way of God. And we should note that there are many different forms of jihad, only one of which is militaristic, which we'll look at lastly, but we might start with some of the others. So for instance, you have jihad of the heart or soul. So the kind of idea of exerting yourself on behalf of becoming a better person, kind of, reflective of the inner struggle of good versus evil in one's mind, right? In terms of how one behaves, that you have right thought, right behavior, and so forth. You have jihad by the tongue, which is basically a kind of struggle against evil through writing and speech, right? Which basically we're talking about proselytizing, spreading the faith, but spreading it by, trying to convince people of the rightness of Islam, not by force. Sermons, such as might take place in the mosque to help people understand how to become better Muslims, how to deal with different issues in life, and so forth. You then have jihad by the pen and knowledge. And so Islam really emphasizes scholarly activity, particularly what today we might call science, right? The idea that, in a sense, learning about how the universe operates is to honor God. It's to struggle against evil through scholarly study, also legal reasoning, right, in terms of applying Islamic concepts to jurisprudence and science. Jihad by the hand. And this is basically, in a sense, to do good deeds, what in Judaism might be called mitzvot. The struggle against evil through actions or using one's wealth, for instance, going on Hajj, taking care of elderly parents, any political activity that you become involved in for spreading Islam, and so forth. And then, finally, we do have jihad by the sword, the armed fighting in the way of God, which does resemble, in some ways, the Christian concept of holy war. Today, most often used by Islamic fundamentalists. So a few things I want to say about this. First of all, historically, generally it was the nature of empires to seek to expand. So whether, in fact, they were expanding in order to spread Islam or using the promotion of Islam as a justification for spreading is difficult to say. And you have the same basic dynamic historically, for instance, in medieval Europe, with respect to kingdoms and empires expanding and the spread of Christianity. Today, the other thing I wanted to say is that today, if you talk to a Muslim and they say that they support jihad by the sword, probably what they understand that to mean is that they are engaging in a defensive action, right? That they have the belief, and to be honest, it's a credible one, that war is being waged against Muslim countries by non-Muslim ones. And I'm not saying it's true, but what I mean by credible is that, if you look around for the last 20 or 30 years, you have not just American, but for instance, also in some cases, Russian military bases, naval bases, and so forth, located in many different Muslim countries, engaging in war in Muslim countries and so forth, whether you're talking about the United States in, Operation Desert Storm in Iraq, or the war in Afghanistan, or, when the Russians were in Afghanistan or in Chechnya and so forth, or what's going on with the Uyghur in China. So, there is this kind of sense among many Muslims that as a religious group, they are under siege. And so, someone of that mindset, and again, I'm not saying it's as simple as that. And, all I mean to imply is that they sincerely feel that way. Someone of that mindset might support jihad as a way of fighting back. This is often what they're thinking when they say they support jihad by the sword. Having said that, the vast majority of Muslims do not support, never mind engage in jihad by the sword. Right? So it's kind of considered something that is really only justified under very specific circumstances. So we'll conclude our discussion of Islam, where we're just trying to provide a kind of basic overview for now, by noting what is the foundational text of Islam, the Qur'an. Famously, I think most people are familiar with this, the equivalent of the Bible, what the Bible is to Christianity. This is what the Qur'an is to Islam. So just to note a few things here. We're going to be looking at it more closely down the road, but The term Quran means recitation. It's kind of the idea that this is basically collecting the prophecies Muhammad received via the archangel Gabriel, who told him to recite. Eventually they were written down and collected into this book. Key here is that Muslims understand this as being literally the word of God, therefore sacred, and that it is imperative that it be read in the original Arabic in connection with that. And so again, we're going to talk more about that later, but what I do want to note here that there's another good reason for thinking about the primacy given the Arabic language in this regard. So you'll find a lot of stuff, for instance, on the internet posted by people who want to discredit Islam or present it, for instance, as a violent religion, where they take quotes out of context from the Quran. And this becomes a very easy way to misrepresent the religion, right? So first of all, the very fact of their being translated into another language, in most cases we're speaking of English, let's just say about any given word in Arabic could be translated into 4 or 5 different words in English. And so depending on how you choose to translate it, particularly if you have malicious intent, it could be very easy to distort what is actually written in the Quran. Certainly to misrepresent it in terms of how most believing Muslims understand a particular passage. There are other reasons why the fact that this idea that it should be read in Arabic, in the original Arabic, is important from a theological perspective. But I did want to touch on that one issue because we're going to this week be examining a bit what are some misunderstandings about Islam and try to understand why we should be careful about things we read that portend to represent Islam in a particularly negative way. In any event, we'll conclude our lecture here with that, and welcome again to this course, and look forward to discussing some of these issues with you in the near future.